Easter Sunday morning, 1829, Charleston, South Carolina. Three small bodies floating face down in the Ashley River, their white Sunday clothes billowing like funeral shrouds beneath the baptismal waters. The woman who held them there, Dinah, the most trusted slave in the Whitmore household, stood knee-deep in the muddy shallows, her dark hands still dripping, whispering prayers in a language that sounded nothing like English. What the authorities found in her apron pocket that morning would shake Charleston's elite to their very core. But here's what they didn't tell you in the history books, what they buried deeper than any grave in Magnolia Cemetery. Dinah wasn't a murderer, she was an executioner. And those children? They weren't innocent victims of a slave's madness. They were participants in something so vile, so systematically evil, that even the hardened plantation overseers who'd seen every imaginable cruelty couldn't stomach the truth. The real horror wasn't what Dinah did that Easter morning. It was what drove a God-fearing woman to believe that drowning children was an act of divine mercy. Welcome to Echoes of Truth, the only channel brave enough to dig up the secrets that powerful families spent centuries burying. I'm about to share with you documents that have been sealed in Charleston's courthouse basement for 194 years. Testimonies that were deemed too disturbing for public consumption, and evidence that will make you question everything you think you know about the antebellum South. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of America's most genteel society? Subscribe right now, comment your location to join this investigation, and prepare yourself, because once you hear Dinah's true story, you'll never see American slavery the same way again. Now, you have to understand what Charleston was like in 1829. Picture a city where Spanish moss dripped from ancient oaks like funeral veils, where the scent of jasmine couldn't quite mask the stench of human misery wafting from the slave markets. The cobblestone streets echoed with the clip-clop of carriages carrying Charleston's elite to their grand mansions, while just blocks away, enslaved families were torn apart on auction blocks like livestock. This was a society built on a foundation so rotten that it required constant lies to keep from collapsing. The wealthy plantation families, the Whitmores, the Ravensworths, the Ashfords, lived in magnificent homes with pristine facades. But behind those walls, in the servants' quarters and children's nurseries, something unspeakably dark was festering. The air itself seemed thick with secrets, and on quiet nights, if you listened carefully from the slave quarters, you could hear sounds that had no business coming from a Christian household. Sounds that made grown men weep and women clutch their children closer in the darkness. Colonel Silas Whitmore was Charleston society's golden boy, a war hero, a pillar of the Methodist Church, and a man whose word was considered gospel in the drawing rooms of the city's elite. I want you to picture this man, tall, distinguished, with silver temples and a smile that could charm the devil himself. His wife, Eleanor, was equally revered, a delicate Southern belle who hosted the most elaborate dinner parties and was known for her Christian charity toward her slaves. To the outside world, they were the perfect embodiment of Southern gentility and moral authority. But here's what the sealed court records reveal. Colonel Whitmore had been systematically training his three children, Margaret, age 12, Thomas, age 10, and little Sarah, just 8 years old, in what he called mastery exercises. These weren't simple childhood games or even typical plantation cruelties. These were calculated, ritualistic sessions designed to strip away every shred of empathy these children might have possessed. The colonel believed that to properly own another human being, one had to extinguish any trace of human compassion. And his children, God help them, were becoming his most eager pupils. The official story, the one that's been repeated in history books and family genealogies for nearly 2 centuries, painted the Whitmores as benevolent masters who treated their slaves like family. They publicly advocated for humane treatment of enslaved people, donated to missionary societies, and were known for never selling slave families apart, a practice they loudly condemned as unchristian. Eleanor Whitmore was particularly celebrated for her maternal care of slave children, ensuring they received religious instruction and basic medical treatment. The colonel even allowed his slaves to attend Methodist services in the basement of the main house every Sunday evening, where he would personally lead prayers and Bible readings. To Charleston society, the Whitmore plantation was a model of Christian slave ownership, proof that the peculiar institution could be both profitable and moral. Visitors from as far away as Boston would tour the property to witness this enlightened approach to slavery. The immaculate gardens, the well-fed slaves, the cheerful songs drifting from the quarters, it all painted a picture of harmonious coexistence that validated the consciences of everyone who profited from human bondage. But let's be real, that facade required an elaborate infrastructure of secrecy and terror to maintain. Hidden beneath the main house was a network of windowless rooms that didn't appear on any architectural plans, accessible only through a concealed door behind the kitchen pantry. The walls were lined with cork and thick fabric to muffle sounds, and the floors were equipped with iron drainage grates that could be quickly washed clean. This wasn't a wine cellar or root storage. This was a purpose-built chamber of horrors where the Whitmore children conducted their mastery exercises under their father's careful supervision. The sessions were meticulously scheduled around the plantation's daily routines, during the midday rest when adult slaves were in the fields, during Sunday church services when potential witnesses were occupied, and late at night when the rest of the household slept. A complex system of bells and signals ensured that no unauthorized person ever stumbled upon these activities. The colonel had even installed a separate servant staircase that bypassed the main floors entirely, allowing enslaved children to be brought to and from these chambers without being seen by house guests or less initiated members of the family. When neighbors or visitors occasionally noticed troubling signs, enslaved children who suddenly became mute, unexplained screams in the night, or the peculiar fact that slave children rarely lived past their teenage years on the Whitmore plantation, there were always reasonable explanations readily available. The colonel would sadly explain that many of his young slaves suffered from constitutional weaknesses and nervous afflictions common to their race, requiring special medical treatments in the privacy of their quarters. When children disappeared entirely, they had been mercifully sold to plantations better equipped to handle their unique needs, or had tragically succumbed to fever despite the finest medical care. Eleanor would tearfully recount how heartbroken the family became each time they lost one of their little ones, painting herself as a devoted surrogate mother, devastated by these losses. The Methodist minister who visited regularly praised the family's Christian dedication to caring for mentally and physically deficient slaves, even when it proved economically disadvantageous. Charleston's medical establishment, eager to maintain relationships with wealthy clients, provided official documentation of various rare conditions and hereditary ailments that justified the high mortality rate among young slaves on the Whitmore property. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because none of this could have continued without the active participation of Dr. Cornelius Ashford, Charleston's most respected physician and the colonel's longtime friend. Dr. Ashford wasn't just providing medical cover-ups, he was providing medical expertise. You see, the mastery exercises weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully calibrated experiments in human endurance, pain tolerance, and psychological destruction. Dr. Ashford would arrive at the plantation monthly for what he called health consultations, bringing with him a leather medical bag filled with instruments that had nothing to do with healing. He meticulously documented the effects of various techniques on the young slaves, recording their reactions, recovery times, and breaking points in journals written in Latin to avoid detection by less educated readers. The good doctor had convinced himself, and the colonel, that this work served a greater scientific purpose, understanding the fundamental differences between the races and developing more efficient methods of slave management. His detailed notes, discovered years later hidden in his estate's walls, read like the fevered writings of a madman, filled with observations about optimal pressure points, progressive conditioning techniques, and the fascinating resilience of the Negro child's psyche under controlled duress. Now you have to understand who these children really were, not the nameless, faceless property that plantation ledgers recorded, but real children with personalities, dreams, and an unshakable faith that sustained them through unimaginable horror. There was Moses, barely 12 years old, who could carve intricate wooden birds with nothing but a rusty nail, and whose gentle humming could calm even the most frightened newcomers to the quarters. Little Rebecca, age 9, possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when other children were in danger and would somehow appear to offer comfort with her shy smile and warm hands. Samuel, the oldest at 14, had taught himself to read by studying discarded newspapers and secretly shared stories with the younger children, filling their minds with images of places beyond Charleston where people like them might someday be free. These children had been specifically chosen not for their physical strength or economic value, but for their intelligence, their compassion, and their unbreakable spirits, qualities that made them perfect subjects for the Whitmore's experiments in systematic dehumanization. The colonel believed that if he could break children like these, he could break anyone. What he didn't count on was that their very humanity would become a weapon in the hands of someone who loved them enough to commit murder. Everything changed on a humid Thursday evening in March 1829 when Dinah's nephew, Jeremiah, witnessed something that would shatter his world forever. Jeremiah was different from the other slave children. Born with what we might now recognize as autism, he was often dismissed as simple-minded by the white family, which ironically made him nearly invisible to them. He had a habit of hiding in small spaces when overwhelmed, and on this particular evening, he had squeezed himself into a gap between the kitchen wall and a large flour barrel, seeking quiet after a day of overwhelming sensory input. From this hiding spot, he watched in silent horror as Master Thomas and Miss Margaret led little Rebecca down the concealed staircase, followed by Dr. Ashford carrying his leather bag. What Jeremiah saw through the crack in the pantry wall that night would haunt him for the rest of his short life. When Dinah found him hours later, still crammed in his hiding place, his eyes held a knowledge that no child should ever possess. He couldn't speak for 3 days, and when he finally told his aunt what he had witnessed, Dinah felt something fundamental break inside her chest. Not her heart, but something deeper, something that had been holding her together through years of unthinkable degradation. She knew that Jeremiah had seen his own future written in Rebecca's screams, and she knew that no God would forgive her if she let it continue. Poor Jeremiah never recovered from what he witnessed that night. Within days, the boy who had once been able to recite entire biblical passages from memory could barely string together coherent sentences. He began having seizures, violent convulsions that would leave him unconscious for hours, his small body twisted in positions that seemed to mirror the agony he'd witnessed. When Dinah tried to explain her nephew's condition to Eleanor Whitmore, hoping to gain some mercy or medical attention, she was met with cold dismissal and barely concealed irritation. These people, Eleanor said with that practiced Southern sweetness that could make poison sound like honey, simply lack the constitution for civilized life. Their minds are like children's, easily disturbed by things they cannot understand. The plantation's overseer, Samuel Hendricks, was even more blunt. Jeremiah was becoming a distraction and a potential problem. If he couldn't work, if he kept having these fits that frightened the other slaves and made them uppity, then perhaps he needed to be sold off to a rice plantation where his particular weaknesses wouldn't matter so much. But Dinah knew the truth. Jeremiah wasn't having fits. He was reliving trauma. Every convulsion was his young mind trying to process horror beyond human comprehension, and when she looked into his eyes during his brief moments of clarity, she saw a desperate plea for her to make it stop, to protect the other children still living in the shadow of that concealed staircase. When concerned whispers began circulating among Charleston's slave community about the unusual number of young deaths and disappearances at the Whitmore plantation, city officials were compelled to conduct what they called a routine inspection to address these unfortunate rumors. The inquiry, led by Judge Marcus Rutledge, a longtime family friend and frequent dinner guest of the Whitmores, was a masterclass in willful blindness and predetermined conclusions. For 2 days, officials toured the plantation's public areas, interviewed carefully selected slaves who had been coached on appropriate responses and reviewed meticulously prepared documentation. Dr. Ashford provided compelling medical explanations for every death, complete with detailed case histories and references to recent studies on racial physiology published by respected northern universities. The colonel presented financial records showing his significant investments in slave welfare, medical supplies, additional food rations, and even a small infirmary building, which conveniently obscured the entrance to the underground chambers. Eleanor charmed the investigators with her tearful accounts of personal attachment to the deceased children and her family's commitment to Christian stewardship. The official report concluded that while the mortality rate among young slaves was regrettably high, it fell within normal parameters for the region and reflected the plantation owners' commendable efforts to care for individuals with serious constitutional defects and inherited weaknesses that made long life unlikely, regardless of treatment. But if you looked closely, really looked, at the surviving children in the Whitmore slave quarters, you could see the truth written in their hollow eyes and unnatural behaviors. Children who had once laughed and played now moved through their daily tasks with the mechanical precision of clockwork dolls, their faces blank masks that never showed surprise, fear, or even pain when injured. Moses no longer carved his wooden birds. His hands shook too violently to hold tools, and he would stand for hours staring at nothing, occasionally whimpering like a wounded animal. Little Samuel, who had once secretly taught other children to read, now couldn't recognize letters at all, not because he had forgotten, but because some essential part of his mind had simply shut down to protect itself from further damage. The few adults who worked closely with these children whispered among themselves about the strange symptoms, how the children would sometimes wake screaming from nightmares about the white room and the doctor's bag, how they would cower and soil themselves at the mere sound of footsteps on wooden stairs, how they seemed incapable of normal childhood emotions like curiosity or mischief. Most disturbing of all was their relationship with the Whitmore children. An unnatural mixture of terror and desperate compliance, as if their very survival depended on anticipating and fulfilling every cruel whim of their young tormentors. They had been transformed into something that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal, existing in a liminal space of pure survival instinct that made even hardened overseers uncomfortable to witness. The sealed trial transcripts, hidden for nearly 2 centuries in Charleston's courthouse basement, reveal the true scope and methodology of the Whitmore's systematic program. Dr. Ashford's confiscated journals, written in a mixture of Latin and medical terminology to obscure their contents from casual readers, document a carefully structured progression of what he euphemistically called behavioral modification through controlled stress application. The program began with psychological conditioning, separating children from their families, eliminating all sources of comfort or joy, and establishing absolute dependence on their captors for basic necessities like food and water. Phase 2 introduced physical conditioning through graduated exposure to pain, carefully calibrated to approach but not exceed the limits of human endurance. The doctor meticulously recorded optimal timing, intensity levels, and recovery periods to maximize psychological impact while preserving the subjects for extended study. Phase 3, the most diabolical, involved forcing the children to participate in the torture of newer arrivals, systematically destroying their sense of morality and self-worth while creating a self-perpetuating cycle of trauma. The colonel's own children served as both observers and participants, learning what their father called the essential skills of mastery: how to recognize and exploit weakness, how to maintain control through carefully administered terror, and most importantly, how to view enslaved people not as fellow human beings, but as fascinating biological specimens whose suffering provided valuable lessons in racial superiority and natural hierarchy. This brings us to Dinah herself, a woman whose true name was actually Dinah of Durham, though she hadn't spoken those words aloud in over 20 years. Born free in North Carolina to a family of respected blacksmiths, She had been kidnapped at age 15 while traveling to visit relatives and sold into slavery through a network of corrupt officials who specialized in disappearing free blacks with forged documentation. For 2 decades, she had endured every degradation slavery could offer, but she had never broken, not even when they separated her from her own infant son, sold him to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where she knew she would never see him again. What sustained Dinah through those years of unimaginable suffering was a fierce, uncompromising faith that burned in her chest like a physical flame. She believed, truly, completely believed, that God had placed her in the Whitmore household for a purpose, that every prayer she whispered over frightened children, every gentle word she spoke in the darkness of the slave quarters was part of a divine plan she was too small to understand. But she was no passive victim waiting for heavenly intervention. Dinah possessed a razor-sharp intelligence that she carefully concealed behind a mask of humble submission, and over the years she had developed an extensive network of information and resources that extended far beyond the plantation boundaries. She could read and write in 3 languages, had memorized entire books of the Bible, and understood more about human nature, both its capacity for evil and its potential for redemption, than any university-educated philosopher. For months after Jeremiah's traumatic discovery, Dinah conducted her own careful investigation, using her position as head laundress to access every corner of the plantation while maintaining her facade of ignorant compliance. She discovered the concealed rooms through careful observation of architectural inconsistencies, spaces that should have existed but couldn't be accounted for in the house's visible layout. Late at night, when the White family slept, she explored these hidden chambers, her bare feet silent on stone floors that had been scrubbed clean but still held the metallic scent of blood and the lingering echoes of children's screams. In Dr. Ashford's abandoned medical supplies, she found instruments that belonged in no legitimate physician's bag, devices designed not to heal, but to inflict precise, controlled damage. Most damning of all, she discovered the doctor's hidden journals, carefully copied each page by candlelight, translating the Latin passages with skills learned during her free childhood when education had been a possibility rather than a crime. What she found in those pages convinced her that this was not isolated cruelty, but part of a larger network of experimental plantations throughout the South, all documenting and sharing techniques for what they called advanced human management. She realized that children from other plantations were regularly exchanged with the Whitmores, creating a rotation of victims that prevented any single location from accumulating too many unexplained deaths or disappearances. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where we dive into the darkest depths of human evil and witness one woman's desperate attempt to fight back against forces that seemed as vast and unstoppable as the ocean itself. I need you to understand, what you're about to hear isn't just history, it's a warning. These weren't monsters from some distant fairy tale. These were respected members of society, pillars of their community, people who would have been welcomed into your church, your social circle, your family gatherings. They wore human faces, spoke in cultured voices, and performed acts of public charity while privately orchestrating systematic torture. If you're still with me, if you have the courage to confront this truth, then hit that notification bell right now and prepare yourself for the most disturbing revelation in American history. Because what Dinah discovered in those hidden chambers would force her to make a choice that would define not only her own soul, but the meaning of justice itself. On Palm Sunday, 1829, exactly 1 week before the Easter morning tragedy, Dinah made a discovery that shattered her last remaining hope that this nightmare could be stopped through conventional means. Hidden in a false bottom drawer in Dr. Ashford's portable desk, she found correspondence with plantation owners as far away as Mississippi and Georgia, detailing plans for what they called the Southern Childhood Development Institute, a formal organization dedicated to training the next generation of slaveholders in scientific methods of human management. The letters, written in the casual tone of men discussing livestock breeding or crop rotation, described systematic programs for indoctrinating white children into viewing enslaved people as laboratory subjects rather than fellow humans. But most horrifying of all was a letter dated just 2 days earlier, written in young Thomas Whitmore's careful schoolboy handwriting, requesting permission to graduate to advanced techniques and proposing the establishment of similar programs on plantations owned by his older cousins in Virginia. The boy had not only absorbed his father's teachings, but was actively working to spread them, turning monstrous cruelty into family tradition. As Dinah read these documents by flickering candlelight in the pre-dawn darkness, she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not rage, which she had carried for years, but a cold, crystalline certainty that transcended human emotion entirely. She was no longer Dinah the slave, property of Colonel Whitmore. She was Dinah of Durham, agent of divine justice, and God had finally shown her what he required of her willing hands. Easter morning dawned gray and humid, with storm clouds gathering over Charleston harbor like omens of Judgment Day. Dinah moved through her usual routines with supernatural calm, preparing the children's Easter clothes, laying out their breakfast, even braiding little Sarah's hair with the gentle care that had made her beloved by the white family for so many years. When Eleanor Whitmore announced that the family would attend early church services before their traditional Easter picnic by the river, Dinah saw the hand of Providence in the timing. She volunteered to take the children to the riverbank ahead of the family to prepare the picnic site, a suggestion that Eleanor praised as thoughtful anticipation of her mistress's needs. But as they walked the familiar path to the Ashley River, young Thomas sensed something different in Dinah's demeanor, some subtle shift in the woman who had been caring for him since birth. When he tried to assert his authority by demanding she walk behind them rather than alongside, she simply smiled and continued walking. When Margaret complained that Dinah was humming hymns too loudly, disturbing the Easter morning silence, the woman's voice only grew stronger. By the time they reached the secluded bend in the river, where the family traditionally held their picnics, all 3 children were looking at their lifelong caretaker with dawning unease, finally recognizing something in her eyes that they had spent years learning to identify in their victims. The calm resolution of someone who had moved beyond fear into absolute purpose. When Colonel Whitmore arrived at the riverbank 30 minutes later with Eleanor and the parish minister in tow, expecting to find a cheerful Easter scene, he instead discovered his 3 children floating face down in the muddy shallows while Dinah stood knee-deep in the water, her Sunday dress soaked to the waist, speaking in what sounded like African languages he didn't recognize. She made no attempt to flee when he screamed her name, showed no surprise when he splashed into the river to pull his children's bodies to shore, expressed no fear when he began striking her with his walking stick while screaming threats and curses that would have made a sailor blush. Instead, she calmly allowed herself to be dragged to dry ground, submitted without resistance when the sheriff's men arrived to bind her hands, and when Judge Rutledge demanded she explain her actions, she spoke in a voice so clear and steady it carried across the gathering crowd like a church bell. I have delivered these children from evil, as any Christian woman would do. They were learning to be demons, and I have sent them to Jesus before their souls could be completely lost. The crowd that had gathered fell silent, not because they understood her words, but because there was something in her bearing, a dignity, a certainty, an unshakable confidence in her own righteousness that made her seem less like a captured criminal than a prophet delivering divine judgment. The subsequent search of the Whitmore plantation, conducted under pressure from Charleston's religious community, who demanded thorough investigation of Dinah's blasphemous claims, uncovered horrors that made even hardened law enforcement officials physically sick. The concealed chambers beneath the main house revealed equipment and documentation that Judge Rutledge would later describe in sealed testimony as evidence of systematic practices so depraved that they challenge one's faith in human nature itself. Dr. Ashford's complete medical journals, discovered hidden throughout the property, contained detailed records of experiments conducted on enslaved children dating back over 15 years. Meticulous documentation of torture techniques, recovery times, psychological breaking points, and death rates that read like the scientific papers of a madman. Physical evidence included restraining devices designed specifically for children's bodies, surgical instruments modified for inflicting non-lethal but excruciating pain, and most damning of all, a collection of preserved organs and tissue samples labeled with victims' names and dates. The investigators also found extensive correspondence with plantation owners throughout the South, revealing a network of experimental facilities that had been sharing techniques and even exchanging subjects for nearly 2 decades. When confronted with this evidence, Colonel Whitmore maintained his innocence, claiming the chambers were used only for medical treatment of difficult cases, and that Dr. Ashford had exceeded his authority without the family's knowledge. Lies that crumbled when investigators discovered Eleanor Whitmore's own diary entries describing the necessary conditioning required to maintain proper racial hierarchy. The true identities of Charleston's most respected citizens began to unravel like rotting fabric exposed to sunlight. Colonel Silas Whitmore, the decorated war hero, had never actually served in combat. His military records were entirely fabricated, purchased through a network of corrupt officials who specialized in creating false identities for wealthy men seeking social advancement. His real name was Simon Wickham, son of a failed merchant from Baltimore who had fled north after embezzling church funds and abandoning his pregnant wife. Eleanor Whitmore, the delicate Southern belle beloved for her charitable works, was revealed to be Eliza Corbett, daughter of a convicted child murderer who had been institutionalized in Pennsylvania before mysteriously disappearing during a patient transport. Most shocking of all, Dr. Cornelius Ashford was not a licensed physician at all, but a former veterinarian named Carl Ashby who had been expelled from medical school after conducting illegal experiments on live animals. These 3 twisted souls had found each other through a network of individuals who shared their particular appetites for cruelty, creating false identities and purchasing social respectability with wealth accumulated through their systematic abuse of human beings. Their marriage was itself a charade. Eleanor and the colonel were never legally wed, and Dr. Ashford was actually Eleanor's brother, making their entire genteel facade an elaborate performance designed to gain access to unlimited victims while maintaining the protection of social status. As investigators dug deeper into the correspondence discovered at the plantation, the true scope of this horror became clear. This was not an isolated case of individual cruelty, but part of an international network of wealthy individuals who had been systematically abusing enslaved people for decades while contributing to what they called scientific research into racial differences and human endurance. The network extended from Charleston to London, where prominent members of Parliament were receiving detailed reports on colonial experiments in human management. Universities in Edinburgh and Cambridge had been unknowingly publishing academic papers based on data collected through these torture sessions, lending scientific credibility to theories of racial superiority that justified continued enslavement. The investigation revealed that over 300 enslaved children had been subjected to these experiments across dozens of plantations, with survival rates deliberately kept low to prevent accumulation of witnesses. Most disturbing of all was evidence that this network was actively working to influence legislation and social policy, using their research to argue against abolition and to promote even harsher legal restrictions on enslaved people. They had transformed systematic torture into political ideology, created academic disciplines built on human suffering, and established institutional frameworks that would outlive any individual participants. The evil that Dinah confronted was not personal but systemic. Not accidental, but deliberately constructed to perpetuate itself across generations. Let's be real about what happened next. Charleston's elite closed ranks like a military formation protecting its wounded center. Despite overwhelming evidence of systematic torture, despite documented proof of an international conspiracy, despite testimony from surviving victims who confirmed every horrific detail, the machinery of power moved swiftly to minimize damage and protect the broader system that had enabled these crimes. Newspaper editors, many of whom owed their livelihoods to plantation advertising revenue, published carefully sanitized accounts that focused on Dinah's crime rather than the horrors that drove her to it. Prominent ministers preached sermons about the dangers of allowing slaves too much freedom and the importance of maintaining proper discipline to prevent tragic misunderstandings, like the Easter Sunday incident. Political leaders used the case to argue for stricter slave codes and increased penalties for servile insurrection, portraying Dinah not as a protector of children, but as a dangerous revolutionary whose actions threatened the stability of civilized society. Most despicably, other plantation owners quietly implemented new security measures designed not to prevent abuse, but to better conceal it, learning from the Whitmore's mistakes rather than their crimes. The conspiracy of silence was so complete, so systematic, that within 6 months of the trial, casual observers might have believed the entire incident was a minor domestic dispute rather than the exposure of industrial-scale child torture conducted by Charleston's most respected families. Justice, such as it was in 1829 Charleston, fell along predictably racial lines with a few surprising twists that revealed just how deeply this corruption had infected society's highest levels. Dinah was convicted of triple murder after a trial that lasted less than 2 days, during which her testimony about the children's systematic abuse was ruled inadmissible as the hysterical fantasies of a disturbed Negro mind. She was sentenced to hang, but on the morning of her execution, she was found dead in her cell, officially ruled a suicide, though the prison doctor's private notes, discovered decades later, described injuries consistent with strangulation by someone much stronger than the frail woman could have managed. Colonel Whitmore and Eleanor faced no criminal charges whatsoever. Instead, they were quietly relocated to a plantation in remote Mississippi, where they lived comfortably until their natural deaths, their new community never learning of their Charleston past. Dr. Ashford suffered the most surprising fate, not legal punishment but recruitment by the federal government, which secretly employed his expertise in human experimentation for military research that would continue well into the 20th century. Judge Rutledge, who had presided over both the plantation investigation and Dinah's trial, was promoted to the state Supreme Court within a year, his career enhanced rather than damaged by his skillful management of a potentially explosive situation. The enslaved children who had survived the Whitmore plantation were quietly sold to different owners across the South, scattered like seeds to prevent any possibility of their testimonies being corroborated or their stories gaining public attention. The true legacy of Dinah of Durham extends far beyond that gray Easter morning in 1829, reaching forward through time to touch every conversation we have today about justice, resistance, and the price of moral courage in the face of systematic evil. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of civilization itself. How societies can produce monsters while maintaining facades of respectability, how institutional power protects its own at the expense of its most vulnerable members, and most disturbingly, how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil simply by choosing not to see what's happening right in front of them. Dinah understood something that her judges, her society, and even many modern observers struggle to accept, that in a system built on dehumanization, sometimes the most moral act is one that appears most immoral to those who benefit from that system's continued existence. She chose to save 3 white children's souls by ending their lives rather than allow them to become the next generation of torturers, and in doing so, she exposed a network of evil that had been operating in plain sight for decades. Her sacrifice, for make no mistake, she knew exactly what would happen to her, shattered the carefully constructed lies that allowed Charleston's elite to sleep peacefully in their beds while children screamed in chambers beneath their feet. The moral of her story isn't comfortable or simple. Sometimes love requires actions that look like hatred. Sometimes justice demands what appears to be injustice. And sometimes the most Christian thing a person can do is something that will make them appear unchristian to the very people whose approval they once sought. So now I leave you with a question that should linger long after this video ends. Could something like this happen today? Would we even see it coming? Or would we, like Charleston's finest, accept the polished facade, the smiles, the sermons, the charity, while the truth rotted beneath our very feet? History doesn't whisper, it echoes. And if you've heard Dinah's echo tonight, then you carry a responsibility. Comment below. Do you believe Dinah was a murderer or a martyr? Subscribe now, because stories like this are buried deep, and only by unearthing them together can we confront the truths polite society still wants to hide. Share this with someone who thinks history is just the past, because the past is never past, not when its lessons are written in blood. And next time, brace yourself. We'll enter another chapter of America's hidden record. The title alone should chill you. Dinah of Durham, the laundress slave, who drowned the master's children on Easter Sunday, a cleansing of sins.